Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Welcome back after the summer. So we had quite a long break this time, and this is our first for the autumn season. So today we're going to hear about the book City of Ladies, written in 1405 by Christine de Pizan, discussed by Dorothea Annison. So Radical Feminist Perspectives is a women-only webinar. It's a series of webinars run by radical feminists whose voices have been cancelled or silenced in universities, schools and the media. Frustrated we can't share what we know in these places, we're offering this online series of webinars here, so enjoy. And thank you so much, Dorothea, and over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Dorothea. I'm from the UK. It's great to be back again after our summer break, and nice to be with you all again. So I'll just talk a bit about why I chose to read this book. I've read over the last couple of years books on feminist history, particularly from Dale Spender and Gerda Lerner, and looking at the feminist writers that came before the sort of 20th century. And within these, Christine de Pizan is often described as the first professional woman writer, and the Book of the City of Ladies as one of the first ever feminist works. So I just thought, well, let's find out a bit more about it. Let's actually read it and see what I think about it. It was published in 1405, so 700 years ago, and it is a defence of women against the sexist prejudices at the time. And it was widely read and popular at the time, apparently read by the likes of Anne Boleyn. And like many books by women, it has since been forgotten and neglected, and it wasn't actually available in an English edition for many, many years. It was translated into English when it was first available, but then it obviously went out of print, and it wasn't until like the 1980s that an English version was available. Because I don't read old medieval French. I'm not any great expert on medieval history, though I'm finding it very fascinating learning more about it. But I just wanted to read it and find out for myself, what does a woman that did live 700 years ago in a very different situation have to say to me as a 21st century feminist? And I thought it was interesting and worth sharing and giving you an idea of what is actually in it, what type of argument she makes, and how it does fit within a feminist framework. So I'll start with a bit about Christine's life. Now, in the opening slide, that picture was Christine at her writing desk with her little dog. I don't know whether you noticed him. But anyway, she was born in Venice in 1364, but she moved to Paris at the age of 4 because her father became the court astrologer there. She had a privileged upbringing, and her father gave her good education for a girl at that time. And actually, that was despite her mother's opposition. She said her mother wanted her to stick to spinning and silly girlishness. So she married at the age of 15, an arranged marriage, and had 3 children. She married to a lawyer at the court. And by the time she was 25, both her husband and her father had died. And that meant that she needed to earn money to support her family, which also included her mother and a niece she was responsible for. And so she turned to writing as a way of earning a living. Initially, she started with poetry, and that was successful. And then she expanded into many diverse subjects, and she wrote on politics, history, warfare, but also appeals for peace. And she got patronage from queens and dukes. That's how it worked at the time. A prominent, rich, royal or noble person would commission a writer to produce works for them. She wrote in French. She was one of the first women to write in French rather than Latin, and that meant that far more women could read her works, because women, upper class women, may well have been literate in French, but it was highly unusual for them to learn Latin at the time, although Christine did, which meant she was able to include Latin sources in her writing. But she was at the centre of French cultural and political life at the time. She wasn't an outsider. At the time, there was a thing going on that was called the debate about women, and it had capital letters, which was basically responses to a well-known at the time misogynistic story that was called The Romance of the Rose. And it accused women of all sorts of deception, of being money grabbing and unfaithful. And her challenges to that, originally written as letters, helped make her famous and sort of behind the writing of the City of Ladies. And this was a time of war between France and England, and the English occupied Paris in 1418. Christine fled to go and live in a convent where her daughter was a nun. And at that point, she stopped writing until Joan of Arc led the French into victory in battle. And so Christine's final work was a poem that she wrote in tribute to Joan and her victories. And then Christine died the following year. And so she didn't actually know that Joan had actually been captured and burnt by the English. So her final work is, again, a tribute to women's courage and achievement. So her most famous work to date, the Book of the City of Ladies, was a political contribution to current debates about the role and behaviour of women and men. And she centres it around her having a vision of three ladies who seek her help to build a city. And the city will be where worthy women can go and live. And the book is a dialogue between Christine and the ladies, where she asks questions about whether what men say about women is correct. And they defend women both directly and by telling stories of notable women. Interestingly, they tell Christine to trust her own judgment and learning, and to remember that speaking evil hurts the men who say it more than women. So it's a very comprehensive account of women in history and culture, and as far as I know, the first from the female perspective. And she takes well-known stories from mythology, from the Bible, from history, and retells them, but alters them to showcase women's talents and achievements and to give a women's perspective on things. And they vary in length from several pages to a single paragraph and tell of hundreds of women. So obviously I'll only be able to mention a few in this talk. And just to say as well, the book was written in 1405, and this was before printing. So each copy had to be written by hand. And the top quality manuscripts that would be given to royalty included pictures and decorations. And it's those pictures that I've mainly used to illustrate the slides we'll see as we go on. So they're things that Christine herself authorised and was happy with. She supervised the production. So she had control of her product. And a little aside, there's a section on the book where they talk about accomplished female painters. And Christine tells of a woman called Anastasia, who's actually worked on illustrating some of her own works. And she says that Anastasia was the best artist in Paris for painting flowers. And the book does contain social commentary and anecdotes from her own time and society, as well as the sort of more mythological stories. And I actually think that the contemporary anecdotes are actually the most interesting part of the book. Christine is the narrator and a character in the book, and so you do get her voice and get a sense of her opinions on things. So if we move on to the next slide, it shows. Yeah, that's an example of a manuscript page. The British Library has a copy of one of the original manuscripts, and it's digitized, so you can see it. And so it just shows how the illustration is there alongside the text. And the book opens with Christine having been reading, and she's reading a book by a man. And she becomes very despondent about the misogyny in the book. And so she says, it made me wonder how it happened that so many different men have been and are so inclined to express so many wicked insults about women and their behaviour. They all concur to one conclusion, that the behaviour of women is inclined to and full of every vice. I could not see how their claims could be true when compared to the natural behaviour and character of women. So she actually finds herself asking how God could have made such a vile creature. So she started to internalize this misogyny. But she has the confidence and courage to fight back, and she challenges all these male experts, intellectuals, authorities, and wants to defend women. So if we go on to the next slide, please. And that's an enlargement of the picture on the previous slide. And it's in two parts. And the first of it shows Christine meeting the three ladies who represent three virtues. And she describes the ladies of having shining, radiant beauty. And they introduce themselves. There's Lady Reason, and she carries a mirror that gives clear self-knowledge. Lady Rectitude, and rectitude means right thinking. She carries the ruler that can be used to divide right from wrong. And Lady Justice, who Christine says has a fierce visage, a face, she has a vessel of gold, and she can measure out what each person is due. And that will decide whether they go to heaven or hell. So they're very powerful, sort of divine women that appear to her. And they tell Christine that they will help her to build a city for worthy women, and that she's been chosen because of her love of learning. And the importance of learning and education is central throughout the story. The city is described as being built on the field of letters, and Christine's pen will become the trowel, and the mortar is mixed in her ink bottle. And when she talks about building a city, some of the pictures and what she talks about, they are literally building a city, and you can see that on the right hand side of the picture. Christine in blue, mixing the mortar, and Lady Reason holding a block of stone. So again, it's women as being active and capable and able to construct a whole city. And the city is described as a refuge and defence against assailants. It's built like a city wall, strongly constructed with fair and sturdy mansions, closed with strong gates. And I like the description of the city as a refuge because it reminded me of how feminists set up refuges for women fleeing male violence, and it promotes the value of women-only spaces. So it's got a similar function to our refuges. It's somewhere where women can go to retreat from men and, live together. And I don't know whether this is the first argument for a separatist space. Convents were women only at the time, but of course they were still subject to the male church and its laws, and here women will be in charge. So the first section of the book is the dialogue between Christine and Lady Reason while they dig the foundations and start to build the walls. And Christine just starts with asking why men are so critical of women. And Lady Reason reassures her that these views are not based on reason or on nature or on God. They come from men's own defects. They're ignorant, jealous, malicious, bitter, or they just repeat what they've read to show off their learning. They know that women are better than them, so they attack them while ignoring their own failings. And this section uses religion to defend women. And it was a time of near universal faith. And people's understanding, or European people's understanding of the world at that time, was completely based on Christian theology and the Bible. So the religious arguments in defense of women were actually really important in strengthening her case. And she's defending women's humanity at a time when it was common to say that women were inferior and defective men. The work of Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, was still influential in it, and that's what it said. So she describes women as having been made by God as equal to men and as having souls of equal worth. And Lady Reason challenges the idea of Eve as being the cause of all sin in the world, which was, an absolute basis of the Judeo-Christian religion, that Eve disobeyed God in the Garden of Eden, and that allowed original sin and caused all sorts of problems. Reason reminds us that Mary, as the mother of Jesus, is a woman who was responsible for saving the world, and basically says that she cancels out whatever Eve did. So she's using the male religion for her own ends, which is something that's repeated by feminists right through to the sort of late 19th century, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and some of the other American suffragists published the Women's Bible, doing a similar thing, challenging and using religion as a defense of women. And she also, again, she provides examples from her own life. And she tells about her, greedy neighbor who goes out and spends all his money in the tavern while, his wife was at home and she couldn't have any wine. He says, she makes up for what I have spent with her own sobriety, and says if we both wanted to spend so much, we could not afford it. So she gets these men sort of damning themselves from their own mouths, sort of showing that they're just greedy and thoughtless and don't care about anybody. And so the next section, she's tackling the idea that women are weak and they're feeble and cowardly. And she gives examples of warrior queens who are wise and brave rulers. So if we go on to the next slide, she talks about quite a number of queens from the past. But the biggest section at this time is about the Amazons. It's one of the longest sections in the book, and she tells several stories relating to different Amazon queens, showing that how women are capable and will rise to any challenge when given the chance. And so I'll give some examples of this. First of all, how they started. And again, this is a picture from it's actually from a different book, not The City of Ladies, but it is one of Christine's books, where she talks about the Amazons, and this is how they started. The men had gone off to war and got themselves all killed. So they courageously assembled and took counsel among themselves, decided that they would maintain their dominion by themselves without being subject to men. They armed themselves, and no one could resist them. Their high fame spread everywhere. One will not find many people who accomplish such noteworthy deeds than among the queen and ladies of this kingdom. And she goes on to say that they armed themselves and they had large battalions constituted solely of ladies and maidens. They advanced on their enemies and laid waste to their lands with fire and the sword, and no one could resist them. They exacted a most fine revenge for their husbands' deaths. And in this way, the women of Scythia began to carry arms and were then called Amazons, which actually means the breastless ones, the breastless ones. And that was because they allegedly removed one breast so they could freely carry a shield or shoot a bow. Now, I've no idea any of this is true or whether it would help, but that is concerning, because that seems to me that is the origin of the idea that breasts are an impediment, not just a natural part of the body, that they stop women being active and independent, leading so many young women now to have unnecessary mastectomies. I don't know whether that's where that all started from, but so the Amazon Queendom lasted for 800 years and they conquered many lands. It's a challenge to the idea of women that are passive and fearful, and not able to be active and independent. I mean, it does praise war and conquest, but that was how rulers were judged at the time. That was the expectation. So as I say, she tells several stories. I'll just give one anecdote here. And this is about how the Amazon queen Thamiris defeated Cyrus, who was a powerful king of Persia. When this wise queen learned from her spies that Cyrus was moving against her with a force great enough to conquer the entire world, she realized it would be impossible to defeat such an army through force of arms. So instead, she got her maidens and positioned them in different ambushes in the mountains and woods where Cyrus would have to pass. And so Cyrus and his entire army were caught in the passes and dark narrows between rocks and in the dark, dense forests through which they had to travel. And she sounded her war trumpet loudly when he arrived. And Cyrus, he was completely dumbstruck when he saw himself under attack from every direction, for the ladies standing above on the high mountains were throwing down huge rocks which crushed his army altogether. They could not advance, because the terrain was so rough. An ambush lay ahead, in which the ladies killed Cyrus's troops as fast as they escaped from the passes, nor could they retreat because of the ambush lying in wait behind them. Thus, they were all killed or crushed, and Cyrus was captured. So, excellent tacticians and able to defeat a well-known conqueror. There is a bit of a downside to the stories of the Amazons, because some of them do end up with the Amazon maiden falling in love with the Greek hero Theseus when he tries to conquer them and things like that. So she kind of does always have to step back, that she can't fully support a separatist woman only land, that the status quo does have to be restored. But I'll go on to some of this more later. So going on to the next section, that's possibly in the next slide. It's possibly the most important question for Christine, and that's why I've had to sort of include a bit more here. And it's basically, Christine starts by asking whether God has let women have the privilege of the virtue of high understanding and great learning, and whether women ever have a clever enough mind for this, because they're told that they can't. And Lady Reason replies, "You know quite well that the opposite of their opinion is true. I tell you again that if it were customary to send daughters to schools like sons, and if they were then taught the natural sciences, they would learn as thoroughly and understand the subtleties of all the arts and sciences as well as sons. Women may have more delicate bodies than men, but so do they have minds that are freer and sharper whenever they apply themselves." So Christine absolutely wants to defend herself, defend learned women. It's really important to her. And so Christine follows up asking, well, in that case, if women are as intelligent as men, why they know less? And Lady Reason says it's because they stay at home and don't get the breadth of experience and knowledge that comes from getting involved in lots of different things. And it's very similar to the argument of Mary Wollstonecraft that women only seem foolish. It's their lack of education and activity that's the cause. And so she's showing right at this point how confinement to the home restricts women's abilities. But again, it's seen as a bit inevitable. She doesn't really, she can describe women's oppression, but she seems to find it hard to actually come up with solutions. But then that is hard. So I'll give her an example of one of her learned women. So this is about Medea. Medea is known for helping Jason steal the golden fleece from her father, and she was able to do that because she was a powerful witch. And so in learning, she surpassed and exceeded all women. She knew the powers of every herb and all the potions which could be concocted, and she was ignorant of no art which can be known. With her spells, she knew how to make the air become cloudy or dark, how to move winds from the grottos and caverns of the earth, and how to provoke other storms in the air, as well as how to stop the flow of rivers, confect poisons, create fire to burn up effortlessly whatever object she chose, all such similar arts. Now, one of the reasons I'm including this story is the legend of Medea is a sort of fairly well-known one, but she's known for, after helping Jason get the golden fleece, and he promises that to marry her and love her and to get her help, but he abandons her, and in her despair she kills her children. Now Christine doesn't mention this. She instead starts with her achievements. Now she does, in a much later section of the book, talk about the faithless Jason and his abandonment of her, but she does not mention the accusation of murder. Now, we, of course, know that it's men that murder their children as revenge against a woman who seeks to leave and be independent, not the other way around. And I guess Christine knew that it was men that were violent as well, and so she just left out that allegation and made sure that this Medea is not the only woman whose achievements she centres separately from any more sort of tragic love story that they're known about. moving on from that, she then moves to the importance of invention. Have women contributed to developing new things rather than just learning from others? It's not the next slide yet. I haven't actually got a slide for this one. And so basically, Lady Reason tells Christine that women are responsible for the vast majority of discoveries and inventions. She presents the Greek goddesses, Greek Roman goddesses, Minerva or Athena, and Ceres or Demeter, as actually human women of great ability. And it was that led them to being called goddesses. Now, Christine does Christianize some of the myths she retells. But here I think she goes further. She's taking achievements that were seen as divine interventions, and she credits human women with their discovery. It is contributing to the removal or downgrading of goddesses, but she replaces them with actual women rather than a male god. And she says, thanks to women, the world was led away from bestial living conditions to a rational human life. Just a few of the things that women have invented. So the alphabet, spelling, grammar, numbers, arithmetic, spinning and weaving wool, wagons and carts, harnesses, steel armour, trumpets and flutes, the cultivation of cereals, the plough, yoking of oxen, milling of flour and baking bread, making tapestries, growing flax for linen, making nets and snares. So Christine reflects shows how much men insult and misrepresent women when they dismiss us as worthless, good only for childbearing. She says, now you can recognise the massive ingratitude of the men who say such things. They are like people who live off the goods of others without knowing their source and without thanking anyone. God placed such great understanding in women's brains that they are intelligent enough not only to learn and retain the sciences, but also to discover new sciences themselves. Indeed, sciences of such great utility and profit for the world that nothing has been more necessary. And on the invention of the alphabet by a woman called Nicostrata, she says, in short, all the good which comes from the alphabet, and thus from books, cannot be told. For books describe and facilitate the understanding and knowledge of God, celestial things, the sea, the earth, all people and all things. Was there ever a man who did more good? Of course, the answer is no. So she's actually saying, women founded civilization as we know it. That nothing that makes our lives easier would be there without women, which I think is really bold for her time when yes, women were seen as, just good, good for nothing, really. So that's the end of the first section of Christine and Lady Reason. So the foundations and the walls are built. So Lady Rectitude is next, and she's going to help Christine construct the buildings of the city and gather the inhabitants. This will be a new kingdom of femininity, better than the Amazons, which will not be defeated by foreign armies, because the Amazons were eventually conquered, I think, by Alexander the Great. So they're building the city some more, and yeah, that's Lady Rectitude bringing along the ladies, some of the ladies that are going to inhabit the city. Now, the first question that Christine asks here is, why do parents prefer the birth of sons to daughters? And Lady Rectitude dismisses this as simple-mindedness and ignorance, a false belief that daughters will cause too much expense to marry off, and that they may be seduced, which would reduce their value in the marriage market. But Rectitude shows how sons are no better. So it's not just a defence of women. She's not afraid to point the finger at men where they get things wrong. So sons are no better than daughters. They too cost money to raise, and then they go off and they lead an immoral and dissolute life. And she says, for sons, it hardly matters to them whether these miserable old people die of hunger, provided they inherit everything. So don't put your faith in your son. Your daughter's more likely to look after you. So this is a good bit, this next slide. And it's when Christine asks about the allegation that marriage causes great unhappiness for men due to women's faults. And she responds with a really good criticism of marriage and what happens to women in marriage. How many women are there who, because of their husband's harshness, spend their weary lives in the bond of marriage in greater suffering than if they were slaves? How many harsh beatings without cause and without reason? How many injuries? How many cruelties, insults, humiliations, and outrages have so many upright women suffered, none of whom cried out for help? I think they may have done. And consider all the women who die of hunger and grief, with a home full of children, while their husbands carouse dissolutely or go on binges in every tavern all over the town, and still the poor women are beaten by the husbands. So not a good word to say for man or the institution of marriage at this point. And she's so good at recognising misogyny and recognising how men harm women and dominate women. But her challenge to it is always restricted by her Christian faith and the social expectations. And there's not the suggestion that women should leave these bad marriages. In fact, next, after doing that critique of marriage, Rectitude then does a bit of a not all men are like that, because she reminds Christine that her own marriage was happy. And she says, you had such a good husband that given a choice, you could not have asked for better. And this introduces some troubling aspects of some of the worthy women. Many are praised for qualities of obedience and self-sacrifice, not just for things like bravery and learning. And then there's a quote then that this is Christine saying this, and it kind of shows this idea of obedience and sacrifice. And she says, I know women whose husbands are so perverse and follow such a disordered life that these women's parents wish that their sons-in-law were dead, and that they take every pain to bring their daughters back to them and away from their evil husbands. But these women prefer being beaten and living ill-fed in extreme poverty and subjugation rather than leaving them. And they tell their friends, you gave him to me, with him I will live and with him I will die. And these are things which one sees every day, but nobody pays them any attention. So she's saying that women just put up with it. It's the argument was still, oh, why doesn't she leave? If it was that bad, she'd leave. And she sort of falls into that trap. But of course, it was a trap for women, because it was very hard for women to be able to earn money on their own, and they didn't get to inherit property. And especially for some of the upper class women, they didn't have any education or skills to earn money. Christine was, very, very unusual in this, that she was able to make this independent life and earn money to support herself and her family. And there was also obviously religious indoctrination about the sanctity of marriage, till death do us part, there was no possibility of divorce. You were just stuck. So the self-sacrifice is jarring, but it obviously does give us a really good insight into the life and expectations of medieval women. She sees the problems clearly, even if it's harder to get solutions. And then so then the next section is a bit sort of dreary in some ways, because it tells lots of stories of women who were devoted to their husbands, some of whom were so distraught when he died that they killed themselves, or just I'll throw one of them in, because I say some of them are a bit strange. And so there was a Queen Artemisia, and after his death, she drank the ashes of her husband, King Mausolus, mixed with wine, because she thought her body was the best resting place for them. But more positive thing, she also built a memorial to him, and it was named the Mausoleum. And this was one of the 7 wonders of the world, in ancient times. And it became a term for all monuments to the dead. So again, she did achieve something. The next section, she gives some examples of good women from the Bible, again, challenging the idea of Eve and sin, that, actually in the Bible, there are many stories of good women. And I'll pick one to tell you a bit more about. And it's a situation where the Jews had been attacked by a Persian general called Holofernes. And he was besieging the city, and he'd cut off their water pipes The food supplies were nearly exhausted. They were barely able to resist, and they felt that they had no hope of holding out. And Judith was in this city, and she was young and beautiful. They're nearly always described as beautiful, but above all, chaste and virtuous. And she began to reflect on a daring strategy. One night she left the city and travelled until she came to the army of Holofernes, and he was happy to receive her because she was so beautiful. She sat next to him, and he greatly valued her knowledge and poise, and looking at her, he became very excited and lusted after her with a great craving. And this went on for 3 nights, at which point Holofernes gave a great banquet for his barons and drank a great deal, until he was inflamed with wine and meat and did not want to wait any longer to go to bed with the Hebrew woman, and he ordered her to come to him. He told her his desire, and she did not refuse, but asked that for the sake of modesty he have his tent cleared of everyone, and that he should go to bed first. And she promised, without fail, to come to him around midnight after everyone was asleep. And so when she thought he was asleep, she approached very quietly and listened and heard him sleeping soundly. She entered and fiercely took the sword which she saw at the head of the bed, withdrew it from its sheath, then raised it with all her strength and cut off Holofernes' head without being heard by anyone. She took her head and as quickly as she could went back towards the city, and she called, "Come on, come open, for God is with us." And after she was inside, they couldn't believe it, but obviously they were very joyful. They hung their head on a pole from the walls. And so next morning they advanced out against their enemies, who were still lying asleep, hung over after the banquet. No one was keeping watch. And therefore the Jews captured or killed them all. I mean, I am a bit ambivalent about the violence in this, but it does show a woman acting independently with courage and determination, and being able to use a man's lust against him to defeat him and his army. There's a great painting of this. I haven't included it, from Artemisia Gentileschi, a 17th century painter, showing Judith cutting off the head of Holofernes. And then I was going to go back now to, I'm going to have a drink of water, if you'll excuse me a moment. So she then returns to a bit of a discussion about education, whether education makes women more or less moral. I think there was a suggestion that too much education would lead to women misbehaving. And it's another contemporary anecdote that I think is interesting. So Giovanni Andrea, a solemn law professor in Bologna not quite 60 years ago, was not of the opinion that it was bad for women to be educated. He had a fair and good daughter named Novella, who was educated in the law to such an advanced degree that when he was occupied by some task and not at leisure to present his lectures to his students, he would send Novella, his daughter, in his place to lecture to the students from his chair. And to prevent her beauty from distracting the concentration of her audience, she had a little curtain drawn in front of her. And Christine does not comment on the supposed need to hide Novella, the idea of a woman as a temptress and of men being able to control themselves. But those ideas are the foundation of so many rape myths. You know, the ideas that are still current about, oh, you know, victim blaming. What was she wearing? Was she asking for it? And of course, the imposition of the hijab and burqa, for the same reasons that women are a temptation. I mean, obviously at that time, if you look at the pictures of women, they were all wearing, they all had their heads covered. They had these quite elaborate headdresses on. So those ideas were current in France at that time. But so that's not a very good bit from our current point of view. But I do actually think that Christine de Pizan is maybe the first writer to challenge rape myths, because on the next slide, we will go on, and she does explicitly ask about whether women want to be raped. And so she says, "I'm therefore troubled and grieved when men argue that many women want to be raped, and that it does not bother them at all to be raped by men. even when they verbally protest. It would be hard to believe that such great villainy is actually pleasant for them. And so the reply by Lady Rectitude is that ladies who live honestly take absolutely no pleasure in being raped. Indeed, rape is the greatest possible sorrow for them. And yeah, this is the one sort of well, you'll see another one later actually, but one of the non-contemporary pictures that I've chosen. This is another Artemisia Gentileschi, who was a 17th century Italian painter, and she was herself a survivor of rape. And this is her version of a story I'm going to tell next about the threat of rape, which is Susanna and the Elders, and it's a story from the Bible. But this picture, in contrast to, clearly shows that Susanna is fearful. She doesn't want the attention. Whereas you look at some other pictures of the same sort of story, and it's much more voyeuristic in terms of looking at Susanna, and Susanna is less resistant. So this is Susanna's story. This valiant lady, Susanna, was alone and relaxing in her garden. Two old men, false priests, entered the garden, approached her, and demanded that she sin with them. She refused them totally, whereupon, seeing their request denied, they threatened to denounce her to the authorities and to claim that they had discovered her with a young man. Hearing their threats and knowing that women in such a case were customarily stoned, she said, "I am completely overwhelmed with anguish. For if I do not do what these men require of me, I risk the death of my body. And if I do it, I will sin before my Creator. However, it is far better for me in my innocence to die than to incur the wrath of my God because of sin." So Susanna cried out, and the servants came out of the house, and to put the matter briefly, with their disloyal testimony, these false priests managed to have Susanna condemned to death. Yet God, who always provides for those dear to him, opened the mouth of the prophet Daniel, who was a little child in his mother's arms, and who, as Susanna was being led to her execution, the great procession of people in tears following her, cried out that the innocent Susanna had been condemned because of a very grave mistake. And so she was led back, and the false priests were thoroughly interrogated and found guilty. The innocent Susanna was freed, and these men executed. Now, leaving out the religious ideas and the idea of sin, this story clearly demonstrates abuse is still experienced, not least abuse by priests, which we all know of instances in our own time. Not being believed in what they say, and the double standard that women have to be virtuous, but men can just do what they like. And so she tells after that a number of stories of women who are subject to rape. And I think she's trying to prove that rape is a terrible thing. It's not a joke, and it's not something that women welcome. But some of them, again, to our ideas, are a bit problematic. So, for instance, the next one she tells after Susanna, it's about a Roman woman called Lucretia, and she was raped by the son of the king. And she did tell her family what had happened, but then killed herself out of shame. Now, this resulted in the evil king and his son being driven out of the city and the Roman Republic established. So her family did defend her, but the story then just becomes a crime against a woman as being told as a tool of male politics to justify the end of a kingdom and the start of the Republic. And it's not questioning the idea of shame and honor that is still used against women, and the fact that honor killings still happen. It's something that's, it's right. And this is really one of the worrying things about reading this book, about how many of these things that she's talking about that are part of the men's oppression of women are still problems for us today. They're not historical. They are, very, they might vary sometimes in its form, but these things are still happening to women as we speak. But she says, because of this outrage, a law was enacted whereby a man would be executed for raping a woman, a law which is fitting, just, and holy. And whatever your views on capital punishment, this is showing rape being taken seriously. But as I say, she does give other stories of suicides after rape, and only one or two of women that were able to get revenge. So, for instance, the Queen of Galatia, after being captured in a war and raped by her captor, again, rape in war, still a issue for women today, was able to trick him, hide a knife, get the knife, and kill him. But the section does end on a slightly more I don't know, maybe a positive note. A nice little story, this. So there was a city in Lombardy that was once captured by its enemies who killed the Lord. The daughters of this Lord, thinking that their enemies were going to rape them, found a strange remedy for which they deserved much praise. They took raw chicken meat and placed it on their breasts. This meat quickly rotted because of the heat, so that when the enemies approached them and smelled the odour, they immediately left, saying, God, how these Lombards stink. So she does get, within all the sort of bad things that are happening, she does manage to get a bit of humour in there as well. And it's most of the time, the stories she tells are always about women, positive women. She criticizes some contemporary men, but she doesn't directly criticize many men of an antiquity. The one except the two, some exceptions. She talks of several of the Roman emperors as examples of weak and evil men, like Nero. And she uses this to show that misogynists don't judge men as they do women. They let off these evil emperors. And she says, you will never find such perversion in women as you encounter in a great number of men, and for every evil woman, there are many evil men, which I think we would agree to. Now, the next section I'm going to look at, it's one of the longer stories in the book. And it's the story of Giselda. And it's a story that's told sort of quite often. She got it from Boccaccio, who was a famous Italian writer. It's included in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So it was a very well-known story to her audience. And basically, it's about a marquis who marries a poor peasant, Giselda. And although she's seen as a good woman, she doesn't seem to do anything wrong. He decides to test her love for him, and he does this first of all when she has a daughter. He says, my people, they don't want to be ruled in the future by the child of a peasant, so the child has to be killed. And she just puts up with this. She says, yes, if the daughter is yours and you can do as you please. And she handed the child over, but secretly the Marquis handed the child to his sister to raise. Following year, pregnant again, this time she had a son. And again, he said, the child will have to be killed because my people won't accept him as a ruler. And again, she didn't protest about this. She handed the son over without showing the slightest trace of sadness. She didn't say anything except to beg that the child would be buried after killing him, so that the wild beasts and birds would not eat the infant's tender flesh. And the Marquis didn't stop at this, having made her believe her two children were killed. He wanted to test her once more. And after being together 12 years, during which time the good lady had acted so well that it should have been more than enough proof of her virtue, he summoned her and told her that he was unpopular with his subjects because he wasn't married to a fine lady. And so he was going to send her back to her father's house and marry another woman. So, he did this, sent her off, and she does quite a long speech at this point, saying that she's going to hand back everything that she was given by him, that she arrived with nothing and would leave with nothing. She handed back her fine clothes and jewels, and all she asked for was a simple slip, and that was to cover her body, the womb in which she had borne his children, And that was going to be in compensation for her virginity, which she had bought, but which she could not return. And it says at this point that the Marquis had compassion, but forced himself to overcome his feelings, and Giselda left and went back to her former life. And after a while, he decided she had been tested enough. He had the children brought back, who would have been teenage by this time, told the court he was going to marry again and prepared a great celebration. And he actually told Giselda to come and oversee the proceedings, as she knew the palace and his ways, and she agreed. And he introduced her to their daughter, of course she didn't know, as his new bride, and asked Giselda what she thought. What do you think, Giselda, of my new bride? Is she not beautiful and upright? He says, indeed, my lord, there is no woman more beautiful or more upright. I would, however, make a single request of you, and give you only one bit of advice, that you neither trouble nor needle her with the torments which you inflicted upon your first wife. This woman is younger and has been raised more delicately, so she cannot bear as much as your other wife did. And at this point, the Marquis gives in, tells her what he's done, restores her to being the ruler. And this is presented as an example, a role model. But I actually think, and I did actually see how she'd altered this from the original. I think she does give Giselda a lot more agency and gives her a voice, which I think in the other ones it doesn't. But it is still worrying that this idea of suffering, of putting up with whatever happens to you, of being patient, the story actually gets called Patient Giselda in some versions, is the right thing to do. The final section with Lady Justice, I'm not going to go into very much detail about, because basically it's the story. The idea is that the Queen of the city will be the Virgin Mary, and she will bring many saints with her. And this it's essentially it's a series of stories about women being tortured and murdered, either because they won't give up their Christian faith, or because they are refusing to get married and want to remain virgins, or both. They're stories that would have been familiar to her readers and would probably have been taken as true, but it's not good to read. It's not good to read at all. What happens is the women are tortured, but God or angels intervene to sort of heal the wounds or destroy the instruments of torture. But all then that happens is she faces more the next day. So if beating her doesn't work, then they'll throw her to the wild beasts or even saw her in two. After great endurance, the women are finally allowed to die and get the martyrdom they desire and go for heaven. And I think it is the pornography of the time. That is what I felt about that section. She may be trying to present women in a positive light by the sort of standards of her time, where virginity was prized, the Christian faith was prized, being a martyr for your faith was prized. I mean, women were still being burned as heretics right up, at that time. But yeah, it's not a good really section to look at in any detail. So I'll move now to the end. Actually, I missed out. I did have a slide on that. So if we get the next slide. And I'll quickly do that and then move on to the end, because we are very, very near the end. So yeah, that's the Virgin Mary and the saints arriving, and that the section on virgin and martyrs is demonstrating God's approval of the feminine sex, is giving women the constancy and strength to suffer horrible martyrdom. And these women's fair lives serve as excellent examples for women above all other wisdom. They're the most outstanding of our city, which is not the best thing, I would say, for us to read. So I'm going to go on now to the final thing, which is where, is it feminist or not? And there is a final slide on that, and it's got a there was many bad things about the Paris Olympics opening ceremony, as I know, but one of the good things was there were 10 statues of notable French women from history, and I was pleased to see that Christine was one of them, and she is getting her recognition in 2024. So I'd say, is it feminist? And it's yes and no. It's an indictment of misogyny, and it's a defense of women against sexist slurs and stereotypes, that women are weak or stupid. And it's saying there's no basis for misogyny. Women have equal worth as humans. They're just as capable as men. They can be rulers and scholars. And they argue for the importance of education to release the potential. She's got the confidence to challenge the male intellectuals, rework their writings. She recognises the impact of male violence and challenges rape myths. So it makes it clear that sexual violence has always been a key part of male domination. And I think in her arguments for education and equality by God, she is part of that tradition sort of running through into Wollstonecraft and Stanton. But it's a book of its time. It's a feudal Christian culture. It's got very different understandings of appropriate behaviours. I mean, everybody was expected to be obedient and know their place in life, and it's very, very, very hierarchical. And so she's restricted by that. But then how realistic is it to expect a medieval woman to come out with the kind of analyses and understandings that we have today? So I think, yes, she answers the question, are women human? Are they as good as or better than men? Are they capable of achievement, of courage? And, she answers those questions with a decisive yes. So she's making a contribution to feminist thought and hopefully inspiring and giving confidence to the women that read her books, that were widely, sort of circulated. And I mean, the fact that her works, like so many others through the centuries, were forgotten about suggests that they were indeed seen as dangerous. So thank you for listening to that. I hope it managed to, make sense. And I can see there's lots of comments, but I haven't been able to keep up with them. If anybody wants to carry on, I am planning to open the breakout room. I don't know whether the link has gone up or not. But I'll just say, Joe's putting it up now. Give me a couple of minutes, obviously, to have a drink and catch my breath. But thank you everybody for being here and listening. I hope to see you hopefully in the breakout room, if not in our future meetings on a Sunday. So thank you.
Brilliant.
And bye.
Thank you so much, Dorothea, on behalf of everybody. That was just unbelievable. It was so interesting, and it's amazing that we've been going for 4 years or so, and so many of us haven't read this. So you've just done an amazingly brilliant job, and it was really
Thank
interesting.
you.
Great.
Thank
Okay,
you.
see everybody next week, or possibly in the
Bye.
breakout rooms. Bye.
Bye.